Does Lane Kiffin have an ace up his sleeve in this wide receiver tight end coach hire that he's making, or will it kind of go what we're all expecting to happen? This is the Locked On Ole Miss podcast.
You are Locked On Ole Miss, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi, I'm Stephen Willis, a former staff member at Ole Miss and a longtime 10-year veteran of the national media with Yahoo Sports and WSMV. Today on the show, we try to make a little bit of sense of these Ole Miss coaching hire and coaching jobs and where they are and how they stand at the moment. As I mentioned, I'm Stephen Willis, and this is the Locked On Ole Miss podcast, your daily podcast on the Ole Miss Rebels, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We're free and available on all the podcast apps and on YouTube. Thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day, and a special hello to all the everydayers who make this show what it is. And everybody that met us at the Brass Tap, thank you very much. We're going to continue to do events like this in the future as well. So thank you, especially David Holly, for putting all that together. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. All right. Ole Miss has two positional openings right now on their coaching staff. Right now, Kelvin Bolden is out on the road recruiting because of those openings, but I digress. It has been long assumed that Kelvin Bolden was about to go on the field and coach. It's been long assumed that Ole Miss was about to hire Joe Cox. And other names have been circulating in and out as well. Yesterday, I believe it was, David Johnson released an article on 24/7 Sports Inside the Rebels, his idea of what was going on. And it was about essentially Mickey Joseph, the head coach of Grambling State, and his interest in the job potentially. Now, those who do not know who Mickey Joseph is, he was a wide receiver coach in 2016 to 2021, that time frame ish, at LSU. He was largely responsible for building up that Jamar Chase and that Jordan Jefferson, that wide receiver room that was so dominant, that continues, honestly, to this day. A lot of that was put together by Mickey Joseph. He went to Nebraska in 2022. Scott Frost ended up getting fired. Mickey Joseph ended up leaving as well because of that transition. Took a year out of coaching, ended up going to Grambling State. There's other names that have been mentioned. There's a lot of candidates that go in and you hear all the time. You see these subscription services, for lack of a better word to say, but a lot of their friends and the people that they want to see get the job, they float that name out there as well. So you're going to see people like Jacob Peeler pop up on the name list. Michael Spurlock is probably going to pop up on the list as well. Those type names are going to just be there because this happens every time a position coach opens up at Ole Miss. I mean, if he wasn't 60 years old or whatever it is, you would see Gunnar Brewer's name on this list as well. But this is just an avenue of people that are interested in the job. Now, if you go back in time a little bit, here's a tweet from Brad Logan talking about Kelvin Bolden, who everybody thought he was going to get John David Baker's spot at tight end coach. Way back whenever it popped open. He left fairly in the middle part of December, but nothing has happened yet, even though like Kelvin Bolden is recruited. And he's honestly, if you look at what Kelvin Bolden has done over the last 3 weeks, he looks like he's been building and preparing to be the guy that replaced Derek Nix in the state of Mississippi. I honestly think that no matter how this shakes out, I think Kelvin Bolden's probably going to be one of the on the field people. I think he's earned that. I think he's working to build relationships doing that. And I think it would be a solid fit. Now, the problem is in these Lane Kiffin hires, I think the media and everybody else has about a 15% hit rate on calling these hires. So it makes me very nervous how comfortable I am with the fact that it was going to be Kelvin Bolden and Joe Cox. Whenever you look at what the hit rate is normally for coaching hires, I should not be that comfortable with those two names. And I still feel that way. I still think it's going to be Kelvin Bolden and Joe Cox. But the other names, it makes you wonder if Lane Kiffin isn't going to try and hit a home run. If Lane Kiffin isn't going to try and do something interesting, something unique. We don't know if it's somebody that he has ties with in the past. We don't know if it's just a person that they're excited about recruiting now, or is it going to be the chalk names that we just assume it's going to be? Mickey Joseph on Ole Miss's coaching staff, I would be interested to see what that looked like for sure. But if Mickey Joseph got brought in, I'm also of the school, just like I said, that Kelvin Bolden needs to be the tight end coach at that time. I think Kelvin Bolden needs to be on the field regardless of how you go. And I think that is the reason this is taking as long as it is. Because Lane Kiffin does have this little Rubik's Cube to put together. Do you go get the big name at wide receiver and you have the tight end coach? Or do you just go with Kelvin Bolden being the wide receiver coach and go for the big name at the tight end coach? It's all an interesting situation. And when you look at this, Ole Miss is also down a co-coordinator because John David Baker had that role as well. So if you brought somebody in, you're technically, and granted, I understand that this is kind of in title only, but you are down an associate head coach and a co-offensive coordinator. So that does give you some flexibility at wide receiver. That does give you some flexibility at tight end to be able to do some stuff. Kelvin Bolden, he is what Derek Nix was in the state of Mississippi 15 years ago. That's exactly what it is. It's a like for like switch. Everything that Derek gave you, Kelvin Bolden is there. He's been building relationships over the last 3 or 4 years. You are going to see one of the strongest versions of Kelvin Bolden there is. Him going on the field is nothing but a victory for Ole Miss football, if that happens. So it leads you to the question, do you get the home run coach at wide receiver or do you get the home run coach at tight end? And I think that might be the delay. Wide receiver, there's a lot of names that you can go after. A lot of people have names. A lot of people have the cachet from the wide receiver coaching positions, more so than the tight end coach. But having that safety net of being able to put Kelvin Bolden in either of those positions, and granted, I think he will be absolutely fine at either of those positions. I think position coaches in college football are extremely overrated. I think a good coach is a good coach. Now, I wouldn't pull a Matt Patricia or whatever and have him as a defensive coordinator and say, well, let's let him try offensive coordinating for a year. I think that's a little bit of a bridge too far. But as a position coach, I think if you're a good coach, you're a good coach. That's just the way it is. So I'm not worried about Kelvin Bolden. Should he become the tight ends coach or the wide receiver coach, if that's what they decide to do? I'm more interested to see who the big name coach is going to be. Now, one thing we haven't seen is Caleb Odom entering the portal. That would have been a clue right off the bat that he was going to follow the person that recruited him to Alabama to his next stop, especially considering his next spot is the team that finished second in his recruitment during the season. So his name not popping up, like I said, the Joe Cox stuff over and over, you hear that. If you go to the Wikipedia page right now, Joe Cox is listed as the tight ends coach at Ole Miss. That's how much and how comfortable everybody feels about this. But the way it sits right now, like the Mickey Joseph, the Jacob Peeler, the Michael Spurlock, the Kelvin Bolden, obviously, those names, Joe Cox. I'm sure there's other names that are tight end coach candidates as well. We'll see how that goes. I'm pretty fired up to see which direction they go. All I know is that on these coaching hires, whenever I feel absolutely sure about who it's going to be, a curveball comes in. And I've been looking straight gas on that, and I just swing through it, and I look terrible. So it kind of is what it is. But Lane has options, and I think he's trying to hit the home run with this hire first. And I think the positional flexibility, you like that, of Kelvin Bolden gives him the opportunity to kind of big game hunt a little bit. We'll see exactly how it goes. Ole Miss has a junior day situated for the weekend. I think this could be wrapped up by the weekend. Might not, but it feels like with a junior day, Ole Miss would want to have some introductions set up at the wide receiver position, especially with like a Caleb Cunningham in state that everybody's going to be after. Whoever you bring in, you have to be ready to put your best foot forward with that guy. So we'll see exactly how it goes as well. Thanks again for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day. We're just getting started. We have an update, well, sort of an update on Nate Kalepo, and we talk about the pre-spring roster as well. Passion, drive, and patience, what brings home the winning trophy, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. And eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. Locked On has launched its first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows that cover every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. So in the first segment, we talked a little bit about that coaching hire that kind of like that fell between the cushions. It was like that coin, something like that just kind of got lost in the couch cushions because of all the transfer portal stuff that has been happening. And that is pretty interesting. But because I wanted to lead with that, there is a little bit of an update on Nate Kalepo. And this is from it's about, I think, a day ago from Canesport in Miami talking about that. And for people that do not know, Ole Miss versus Miami has been widely, I guess, the competition for Nate Kalepo. And this is a player that I'm going to be very excited about if he picks Ole Miss. Not because I think Ole Miss needs it, just because I think he was the alpha of the best offensive line in the country. And putting him at guard and putting him next to the players that are coming in means this offensive line has a chance to take a step or two up over where it was last year. And this was an 11-win offensive line last year. So we'll see with them coming in and all of that happening. But Nate Kalepo, and this is from, I guess, Matt Shadell. He said, Kalepo tells us this evening he'll announce sometime in the next couple of days where he's going to school. And then he says, since Miami's deadline to enroll for spring is tomorrow, which I believe that is actually, as you're watching this, midnight last night, and Ole Miss's deadline is the 31st. That's not a good sign for the Canes. So that's the reason I say it's kind of a sort of update, but this is coming from the Miami side of things as well. And if that's the case, and he's past the deadline to get in, there's only one place he can go. Well, I guess two if you count going back to Washington, but he's already said his goodbye to Washington. So has to be a pretty good situation for the Ole Miss Rebels. And if you look at the roster at Ole Miss, because if you get one, I think they're probably going to get Buelow as well. And not just because it's a package deal or anything like that, just because you don't hear anything about him. So we'll see exactly how that goes. And if you look at the offensive line, should they decide to commit to Ole Miss, you have tackles taken care of because you have Jaden Williams, you have Micah Pettis, you have Diego Pounds, and you have Jerquan Scott, who also can play out there as well. He's recruited as an interior guy, but he can play out there as well. He's kind of a plus version of Quincy McGee is what Jerquan Scott is. He's played a ton of football. And then if they get Nate Kalepo and they get Julius Buelow to go along with that, and depending on whether or not one of them can snap the football, to go along with Preston Cushman, to go along with Bryson Sanders, those guys, and you can see how the offensive line could take a step up in a very big way, because Jeremy James is coming back to school. You know, Caden Davis coming back to school. I know that's a special teams person, but I just haven't mentioned that on this show. But he's coming back as well. And the offensive line are going to be about 10 deep. They're not going to play them, all of them, because this offense doesn't do that. We talk about the tempo being above everything, but you got 10 players that played a lot of football over the last several years. And you just have to mix and match and find the right players to work with and make it work to where you can put an effective unit on the field. Now, because this is an RPO system, and I'm going to say this all the time, for people that think our offensive line was problematic a year ago, we run RPOs, which means everything is a run block. Everything that they do on an RPO is in a run block. And because of that, it's easier to pass rush on a run block than otherwise. So if the quarterback holds the ball a little bit too long, it can be exposed quickly. Too many deep third level RPOs, it can be exposed quickly, and the offensive line can look worse than they are. But these players are probably going to be a little bit of an upgrade. And if the goal is the national championship, if that is the goal for Ole Miss football in 2024, which, I mean, they're close enough there. It should be kind of. This is probably the right move. And the offensive line right now, if you get those two players, is where it needs to be going into the spring. To go along with, I'm going to say the running back room is where it needs to be going into spring. Even though another running back would be nice, not necessary. You're in good shape with Ulysses Bentley. You're in good shape with Kedrick Toscano. You're in good shape with a Logan Diggs that is coming back from an ACL. You probably do need to add another running back in the spring window. In April, you need to go get another one, but going into spring, this just means that Kedrick Toscano is going to get a ton of work in the spring, and that's nothing but a good thing. Wide receiver room, it's the best in the country. They're good. Quarterback room, good. Tight end room, good. Defensive line room, good. It's also one of the best in the country. Linebackers are fine. They're doing some work in the secondary. I think, honestly, right now, it is pretty good. So I think they're where they need to be going into spring. They also return their kicker and their punter, and their kickoff man is also their field goal kicker, who just consistently put balls out of the back of the end zone last year. They're in good shape on their roster all over the field. The one thing that I want to see, and this spring, they're not going to pay attention to it. You won't even get a single story on it. And being down here, I can't put my own eyes on it. But what I want to see is the second person snapping the football. We know that Caleb Bourne can do it. I want to know who the two player is. So if Caleb Bourne gets injured, you don't have this musical chairs and everything going wrong to where one player causes three players to be out of position. That needs to stop. And if that goes down in the spring, which like I said, I think it could be all right with these players that are coming in, and Jerquan Scott has the ability to potentially do that. I think he might have been, in his Swiss Army knife career, snap the ball a little bit as well. So we'll see exactly how that goes, especially in this era when everything is in the shotgun. So I'm pretty fired up about that. Now, one thing that's pretty interesting, still more to come on Locked On Ole Miss, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. FanDuel has released their game of the year lines, like all their games of the year, like 10 of them. And Ole Miss versus Georgia is one of them. We'll let you know how that's going to go next. Thanks for making Locked On Ole Miss your first listen every day. And shout out to the everydayers. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows that cover every single league. For your second listen, go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 stream channel. Be part of history. All right, so FanDuel, I'm a huge fan of FanDuel. FanDuel, a title sponsor today's show, pretty consistently on the Locked On brand. You'll find the FanDuel sportsbook information around. And they released their college football games of the year. There's about 10 games that they popped up and put lines for. And Ole Miss versus Georgia is one of them. And before we put that up there, it's interesting because I think Ole Miss versus Georgia has a chance to be the game of the year in the SEC. The game that Alabama versus LSU has been for many of these years, what Tennessee versus Florida used to be. I think Ole Miss versus Georgia this year has a chance to be that game. And whenever you look at it right now, Georgia kind of walked on Ole Miss in Athens last year. It was like 52-17. It was a pretty good beatdown. The opening line in this game is Georgia -3.5. Slightly more than a pick 'em. They're saying that basically Georgia's about a touchdown better than Ole Miss because if you look at the home field line, it's about 3 points. The over-under in that game is 54.5 points. You have Carson Beck at quarterback for Georgia that most people think is the favorite for the Heisman. You have Jaxson Dart on the other side, which is a top 10 Heisman pick as well and has a chance to make a major run on what's going on. The difference that you're going to have in this football game resides on Ole Miss's trenches. I think that is where you're going to see this look a little bit differently. Whenever you have Walter Nolan and J.J. Pegues and those guys in the middle of the field going against that Georgia offensive line, you're not going to have a situation like you did last year where Carson Beck could sit back there and, diagnose everything and let it go, where Georgia played like the number one team in the country that night. I don't think it's going to matter necessarily if Georgia has that type of performance, even with all of the studs that they have on defense. Georgia's defense, I think, is slated to be all rivals or on 3 or 247 top 100 level players in 2024. I don't think it's going to matter. This is probably going to be the best wide receiver room that Georgia runs across. This is probably going to be the best tight end room that Georgia is going to run across, and maybe outside of practice, the best quarterback they're going to run across. So Georgia's defense is going to need to be good for that game. It's not that they are good. They're going to need to be good because of what's going to happen. Because that game is going to be, as it sits right now, probably a primetime ABC, Chris Fowler, Kirk Herbstreit game, 7 o'clock on ABC, and everybody's excited. Everybody's been partying in the Grove all day. Everybody's going to be ready to go. And you're going to have a situation where the cauldron is going to be developed. Think 1990, let's see, 92, Ole Miss versus Georgia with Abdul Jackson and Cassius Ware and Dwayne Dotson and the Red Death defense to where Cassius Ware almost killed Eric Zier, resulting in a fumble recovered by Ole Miss to where the Rebels actually ended up winning the game. Maybe that was in 93. You're going to have that atmosphere get developed. You're going to have that type of thing ready to go. And a defense for Ole Miss that can make a play, a game-changing play to do that. Now, one of the things I've talked about is when you have a situation to where you have an elite defense. Ole Miss had more talent than most everybody that they played last season. The only people that but that are the people that were always going to but that. Ole Miss had more talent. That's the reason they beat Arkansas. That's the reason they won those games late, because of the talent that has grown up. Ole Miss was in close games and had ability to get got from time to time because they maybe wasn't good on the offensive line. But whenever you look at exactly what Ole Miss has brought in on the offensive and the defensive line, you know that is going to be a wrecking crew with the talent that they're returning as well. It should be a whole lot of fun. Let's bring it up again, okay? Let's bring it up again. Georgia's favored by 3.5 points over Ole Miss. in Oxford, Mississippi. Like I said, that's going to be the ABC game of the week. That is going to be a massive, massive football game, and we'll see exactly how that goes. I'm pretty fired up. I'm pretty fired up indeed, and I can't wait for it to happen at all. Now, it's really, really interesting to see all the stuff that's going on. You've got basketball that's going to happen, and Tim Thomas, we're going to have him tonight to where he does all the analysis on the basketball game. Don't worry, you're not missing a thing. It's just not on this show. But when you look at what's coming on with basketball and how Ole Miss is going to be fighting, looks like all the way through to make the NCAA tournament throughout March, and you look at exactly what this means in baseball with all the transfers coming in. I've already talked to Derek Vandigriff today about starting up our baseball videos again as well. Those are going to start in probably about 2 weeks as well. When you look at where Ole Miss sports sits right now, I don't know that it could be in a better place. I don't know that it can be anywhere better than it is right now. You have a football team that is up at the top of the conference in a glory days type period for Ole Miss football, because it is. There's not many people that were alive during the late 50s and 60s and early 60s. But as it sits right now, Ole Miss is sitting third over the last 3 years in the SEC in wins behind Georgia, who has had one of the most dominating streaks in college football history, and Alabama, and that kind of goes without saying. And Ole Miss is building step by step. It feels like they're adding bricks to an already solid foundation for a really good setup that could be for Ole Miss fans over the next 2 or 3 years. Really interesting stuff. I'm really excited. Jaxson Dart and all those guys coming back. I wish football season was here and ready to start now. Anyway, thanks for making the Locked On Ole Miss podcast your first listen every day as we continue to turn our attention to the portal and look to basketball and start baseball coverage. For your second listen, Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows that cover every single league. For your second listen, go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube. Subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 stream channel. For those on you on YouTube, we'll send you there right now. Hotty toddy.